final panel of our annual meeting. We made it till the end. It has been so great to see you, and I think we couldn't find a better way to actually close the meeting than having this panel discussion on the frontiers of DMDU. Let me introduce our panelists very quickly. Andrew Rebkin is one of America's most honored and experienced environmental journalists and the founding director of the new initiative on communications and sustainability at Columbia University, Earth Institute. At Columbia, he is building programs, courses, tools, and collaborations, bridging communication gaps between science and society, and to cut climate risk and boost social and environmental resilience. Nidhi Kalra is a senior information scientist at the RAND Corporation. She has previously served as director of RAND San Francisco Bay Area Office and co-director of RAND Center for Decision Making under Deep Uncertainty. Her research focuses on autonomous vehicles, policy, climate change adaptations, and tools and methods that help people and organizations make better decisions amid deep uncertainty. Carla is the lead author of the study Driving to Safety: How Many Miles of Driving Will It Take to Demonstrate Autonomous Vehicles Reliability. She has testified on autonomous vehicles policy at 3 congressional hearings and helps organizations improve the way they make decisions. Gabrielle Wong Paradis is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science at Center Fellow at the Goods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. Her research focuses on applying behavioral decision research methods to address challenges associated with global environmental change. She recently served on the National Academy of Sciences Committee titled Long-Term Coastal Zone Dynamics, Interactions and Feedbacks Between Natural and Human Processes and Their Implications for the U.S. Coastline. Dr. Wong is a faculty affiliate at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and is the Social Science Research Liaison for the Climate Advocacy Laboratory. She received her PhD on risk perception and communication from the University of California at Berkeley. And finally, Julie Rosenberg is a senior economist in the Office of the Regional Director for Sustainable Development in Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. She currently focuses on recovery strategies from the COVID-19 crisis, working with countries on building more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth trajectories. Julie is a founding member of this society and has been working over the past 7 years to support the World Bank operations through the applications of DMDU methods in the planning of projects in sectors like transport, water, or urban development. She also applies DMDU methods in her research work for the World Bank, and she published the flagship report, Shockwaves Beyond the Gap, How Countries Can Afford the Infrastructure They Need While Protecting the Planet. Thank you all for making the time to be with us today. Andy, I leave it to you now.
Great. It's a pleasure, as it was a couple of days ago, or was it just yesterday, to be interacting with folks here at your meeting. I had the honor several years earlier of speaking at one of the meetings of the Society in Washington. And I was thrilled actually to discover that there was a community, that there is a society for decision-making under deep uncertainty. As a journalist working on issues like climate change, earthquake preparedness, a little bit on pandemic preparedness, and learning over the years and decades as it is now about how poorly we seem to attack certain kinds of problems, certain characteristics, certain risks with certain characteristics. I was struggling to think there must be some better way. And then I met Rob, well, I'd known Rob Lempert for a long time through climate stuff. And he said, there's a community. So hallelujah to that. I hope you all give yourself a big group hug out there for doing the work you're doing. It's not easy. As we said in our discussion on my webcast yesterday, there's a lot of path dependency around us in how the organizations, governments, communities around us are stuck on a different kind of way of approaching risk and don't maybe recognize some of the realities that you all know too well. So I thought today, the frontiers of DMDU, of decision-making and deep uncertainty, for both the internal audience and for those who might watch this later in some way or other, they seem to have there seem to be two frontiers. One is actual frontiers in methodology and getting your work done. and then in translating, normalizing this capacity in society more generally. So we'll go around the circle here a little bit and just get your impressions of when you think of the work you do and your different vantage points in this context. What is your frontier? And we'd start with Nithi Kalra, who's at RAND, and you're working on autonomous vehicles. You know, these emergent technologies like that come with so many questions. And you're back your earlier work, you know, at the World Bank, and even I noticed in your bio advising then Senator Kamala Harris, who is going to be in a very important position shortly. She already has been in important positions. So Nithi, when you think about this, what's your like top? What wakes you up early in the morning, or makes it hard for you to go to sleep at night?
Those would be my kids.
Oh,
but,
that right.
But
decision making in complete chaos.
That's right. You know, I think of it in sort of 3 dimensions of frontiers. You know, horizontally, I think I look back over the course of this community's work, and so much of our work is focused on climate change, energy, environment. And that's because, in a way, these are at the frontiers of long-range risk. But for me, I've started expanding the work that I do to other areas. So autonomous vehicles is one, but also, for example, criminal justice reform and criminology. I think so. This is the horizontal frontier for me, which is how do we get uncertainty and risk to be normal words in education, healthcare? Now, COVID-19 has done that, forced that upon us. And so, you know, part of it is reconciling how the surprise of this pandemic, reconciling the surprise of this particular pandemic with the expectation that a pandemic is bound to occur. And that in fact, we prepared for it. And that is what resilience looks like. The other axis for me is vertical, which is risk and uncertainty. Deep uncertainty should be words that are in the public's nomenclature, right? This should be in part of the public vocabulary, but also our leadership's vocabulary. My, you know, personal wish for the next 4 years is that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden use the phrase deep uncertainty in a speech and talk about how we will face deep uncertainty. We will manage it. It's there. And I think we need the conversations around what this community does to be had across sectors and at the highest levels of our policymaking, as well as a conversation we have every single day.
I'm sure that last point, I'm sure we'll get at with Julie and Gabrielle too, but I wanted to dig a little deeper on what you just said, because it's so important. The challenge, and I've seen this covering disasters like 9/11, when I was writing about the dust and smoke in downtown Manhattan, how dangerous it was. Politicians' instincts is never to say, we know, we don't know. And so you're grappling with that, the behavioral dynamics that are just really deep rooted. You know, elected official doesn't want to admit that there's something we don't know, or actually that we can't know. So how does that, is that part of the learning curve to make them feel comfortable about using a phrase like that?
I think, yes, but also that's why I don't think we can have this be a conversation that our policymakers have without it being a conversation that the public has. If the public can't talk about uncertainty and risk, then neither will politicians be able to, because it will be political suicide to say, I don't know, or I'm doing my best to manage the risk. No, nobody votes for that person, right? Get them out of here.
Right.
So in a way, I think this needs to be bottom up even more than it is top down, but the two things work together, right? And so I think we need to address both ends of this spectrum so that there's appetite, there's a demand from the public to have a better conversation around risk, and there's an ability for politicians to have that conversation without facing the threat of getting voted out of office.
I couldn't agree more. And this goes back into the roots of it's a systems problem, is what you're saying. That right through how we teach kids forward through how we have conversations about risk. This is an implicit need. Let me get Julie in on this question. Climate resilience, adaptation are issues where I still, having written about climate change for more than 30 years, like here's my 1988 article, my cover story in Discover magazine from 1988. Talk about systems problem. We were selling global warming concern on the front cover, and we were selling cigarettes on the back. tobacco ad on a science magazine. There's still this assumption, like even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process is about reducing uncertainty. Almost everything you look at the those, very likely to, the way we gauge understanding is incremental, and there's an expectation that each panel, each report will take us further toward understanding, let's say, sea level rise rate. But the science, as I've been covering this, is often you find that more science actually makes things more unclear. Hurricanes used to be simple: heat up the oceans, they make hurricanes more dynamic. And then the same scientists over time would say, well, yeah, but there might be fewer hurricanes in a warmer world. They'll be more powerful. But if you're the mayor of a coastal city, what does that say? So I guess I want to get back at that question of expectations, Julie, from your standpoint. What is it? How important is it to have a community, whether it's scientists or the public or decision makers, understand that there's different characteristics of problems, and some of them, this gets back to what Nithya just said, you have to be comfortable with the fact that there's going to be known unknowns. They'll be deep for a long time. So we're kind of digging deeper on the same question, but in the climate context, is that still a challenge? Are we still expecting too much from science sometimes?
That's a very difficult question. I think you're right that the IPCC actually shows more and more uncertainty over time, report after report on future climate impacts. But I think there are also some robust results that are emerging from some of the simulations. And I know the climate change mitigation scenarios better than the climate science scenarios. But from all the simulations, I mean, there's still huge uncertainty on the cost of some technologies, on the social cost of carbon, if we want to use those kinds of variables. But I think there are some robust messages that we get from those simulations on what's feasible in terms of decarbonization and how we can get there with the technologies that we know exist today. Knowing that we also need to expect some unexpected technological change. But even with what we have today, we have some ways forward, and we can help countries put together some plans to go there. The biggest uncertainties come from preferences and political opposition. And I think we've understood that from a technical perspective, there are many things that can be done, but people don't want it for a lot of different reasons. And there's a big communication issue. And I don't know if it's just around the uncertainty or it's also around the fact that we haven't been looking very well at the distributional issues and the distributional consequences and the poverty consequences of all these big changes that are going to come with climate change and with decarbonization. So I have a feeling that if people are opposing some reforms that we think are really good, there might be a good reason. And we might want to reach out and understand why they're opposing them instead of trying to force it upon them. And that's one of the things that DMDU does well, is bring people in the decision-making process, and something that I'd like to work on more in the future if possible.
Yes, this came up in our chat yesterday in that context of creating the potential for mapping those conversations, basically. So when you introduce, sorry.
No, I was going to say, including people who usually don't have a voice. And that's something
for sure
new technologies might help. I mean, I work in Latin America and the Caribbean now, and the big question is, how do we get indigenous people to participate in decision-making processes, because they've been excluded from decision-making for a very long time, and yet they have very big stakes in those environmental questions in particular.
Yeah, well, I've written a lot about biodiversity conservation, and that's an area where if you want to preserve 30% of the remaining terrestrial biosphere, and you're not talking to the indigenous communities who have been in the forest actively preventing incursions that are deforesting and the like, you're missing a big chunk of the solution landscape too. So that it's just very important. I was taking notes here and I lost my place. Gabrielle, for you in this context, you have a very deep background in risk perception and at the individual level. And maybe this relates to what I was talking with Nithya about too. How does that color things? I'll give you a quick example. One of the most striking statistics from the election results was that in 130 counties that were Trump counties in 2016, the ones that had a higher COVID-19 impact, the ones that had more experience with the pandemic, direct experience, went for Trump even more. Now, for those of us who have been going crazy about anti-mask, rhetoric and the like, that feels initially completely bizarre. But when I talk to behavioral scientists, they go, no, not at all. So how important in looking at a decision making under deep uncertainty is understanding basic behavioral human norms and the like?
Oh gosh, I think that it's incredibly important. And I should say, and I teach a class on decision science for environmental threats. When I talk to my students about why it's so important to understand how people make decisions at this point in time, we talk about how heuristics and biases historically used to serve us quite well, but we're now moving into an era where we are seeing unprecedented threats, and we're not, because we're encountering threats and risks that we haven't seen and uncertainties that we aren't aware of, that we're not able to kind of make decisions that would normally serve us well. With respect to what you're talking about, I think what's at play is processes of motivated reasoning.
Right.
And I think, I'm actually doing a series of studies looking at climate attribution and the extent to which people's experience with events, whether that be hurricane events, wildfire events, or even COVID, is influencing their understanding and appreciation of a link between those types of extreme events and what we as humans are doing to change the environment. And what we're finding just from preliminary findings is that, as you might expect, we're seeing a partisan split where those that think that climate change is occurring and have some experience with it, those negative experiences are actually amplifying their perceptions that there is a link and there's something to be concerned about. Whereas those who come from a different perspective are, through processes we hypothesize and motivated reasoning, are saying they don't see that link. So those things are very important in terms of understanding what we're seeing right now.
So this question will be for all of you going forward. Maybe we'll swing back to Nithya, but it gets to something that was revealed to me in another episode of my webcast recently. We were talking about energy innovation and the importance under a new administration of ramping up basic R&D on energy solutions for if you want to have buy-in on climate decarbonization of the energy system. And I brought up, though, that when you look at our investments in science and climate, there was a recent study by Indra Overland and Sovakul, I think, which showed that the investment in social and behavioral science is minuscule, absolutely minuscule compared to the investment we make in basic research on understanding the climate system itself. And it seems like such an imbalance when you think of how everything you're all talking about, decision-making under deep uncertainty, relates to human interactions around information as much as it relates to what's actually going on in the environment. Is that part of the, like, for a frontier, would it make the lives of the DMDU community easier to have a more even approach to how we invest basic science? And this might sound self-serving for all of you, so, but don't be afraid to answer yes if you think there's still basic gaps in understanding that could help make the mapping and the decision-making process better. Nithya?
Yes. I mean, but to put it into context, I was recently informed, I didn't know this, the Air Force Research Lab, this is not to be quoted, but I'll restate. The Air Force Research Lab, which is the Air Force's, prime research organization, has a $3 billion budget. which is more than all of the EPA, which is more than the it's the way in which this country and the world really invests in what we think of as threats and how we're going to respond to them. It's been said, if climate change were aliens invading this country, we would be set. We would have defeated this enemy, right? But it's us. We don't know that much about defeating an enemy that is in a way ourselves, our own economic system, our own wants and needs, our own limitations. And the money and innovation, I think, is desperately needed, right? If we could see this threat on the scale that we see military threat, this would be orders of magnitude more investment. And that's what's required. This is existential. And one of the challenges, I think, of this community is that uncertainty historically has been a tool to undermine an issue. Oh, we don't know, ring hands. There's a great book called Merchants of Doubt about the role of uncertainty in undermining science and environmental action. So the challenge in raising this issue of what we don't know is to not then become a tool for inaction for those who would prefer no action were taken. So I think there's complicated things at play, but definitely more investment is unquestionable.
Yeah, boy, you brought up a point there that's the public misperception of what's meant by the word uncertainty. This has come up over and over again in my reporting and thinking the last few years. It's easy to exploit it as a reason for waiting. If you think that uncertainty equals ignorance, and even that, of course, doesn't make sense if you're facing a big risk. So I guess basic literacy in that concept would be some kind of predicate to at least having an honest public discourse. And then you still have to deal with those issues of cultural cognition and the like that Gabrielle had identified as well. But at least you have some sense of what you mean. And in 2010, I wrote about an IPCC. They commissioned for some communication consultants to write them some advice on how to communicate with the public. This was ahead of AR4, AR5, I can't remember, one of the IPCC reports. And the advice, I showed this yesterday. Below is a list of words that mean one thing to scientists and something else to the public and reporters to lower the risk of being misunderstood. Avoid them. And the list included the words uncertainty and risk. And personally, I'm not a high-paid communication consultant, but I think the world would be better off if scientists simply said over and over again, when we talk about uncertainty, it's knowledge. It's a form of knowledge. Bounded uncertainty, like plus or minus X, leads to some space you can work with, right? And so again, let's continue down the chain here. So Julie, when you think about this, the public sphere as it perceives a policy discussion, the World Bank and the like are different than, US politics in some ways, but the landscape must still have some of the same tensions when uncertainty is sort of misused or mischaracterized.
Yeah, I think what's difficult to communicate is that, yes, there are things we don't know, but there are also very useful things we know that can be used for decision. And it's hard to start the conversation by saying, oh, actually, we don't know a lot of things, and then people stop listening, and then but actually, let me help you anyways, because I actually know a lot of things that might still be useful. I don't know in which order you have to bring the uncertainty in the story. Maybe first show you're really smart, and then say there are still some things we don't know, but I'm going to help you deal with it. I think in general we could be better at communicating this. I'm not sure those high-paid consultants you were mentioning that said we should just avoid the word uncertainty have the right answer. But in the way we visualize our results and in the way we present our approaches, I think there's still some work to be done. But to go back to your previous question, I think that the fact that we need to bring more human side uncertainty to the whole climate change policy environment, I think that's crucial. And I've seen these changing over the years in the society, so I'm really glad. I think meeting this year in particular has a lot more sessions and talks that have more qualitative approaches, that use a lot more participation, and that look at kinds of uncertainties that are not even related to climate change. We've had a lot of papers from economists, political science, qualitative approaches, 2 sessions on COVID, 2 sessions on decarbonization. So I think it's really encouraging that we're looking at more and more at those other types of uncertainty that often are bigger than climate change uncertainty. I mean, and even Pat Reed in his keynote presentation showed that when you bring the financial models in, he was talking about water management, right? When you start looking at the financial aspects, then suddenly you change the prioritization of the interventions that you want to do. So, and then I was in the economics session, and one of the presenters said, oh, actually, you know, there's not much uncertainty around economics. It's more around some of the human behaviors and fear and other things that we usually don't put in our economic models. So I don't know if it's each discipline that finds that when they expand the scope, the uncertainty is much bigger than in their discipline, or I don't know if it's because the human sides of things is just so much more uncertain than the technical aspects.
So here's another question for you that came out of what you just said for everyone here. How much of the frontier here in thinking about widening the use of the DMDU tools and methodologies and mindsets can only happen if there's better interdisciplinary conversations? So it's not just between expertise in the public, but between social and physical scientists, engineers, economists. Is that, which is a bigger frontier? Or you know, how important is that? How vital is that to this question?
No, it is vital. And I think that's one of the great strengths of this society is the multidisciplinary aspect of the group. We have a lot of people here do multidisciplinary work. They have degrees in different disciplines, or they work in different disciplines, even though it's not the degree that they earned initially. And I think that's also what helps expanding the scope of uncertainty. And it's really hard. I was going to bring this up because I've been working for the past year on this project in the Caribbean on resilience. It's like broadly defined resilience. And there was a very hard discussion at the beginning of the project between the country director, who wanted us to talk about any kind of shock that can happen in the Caribbean, and most other people who said, no, but let's focus on hurricanes and natural disasters and sea level rise because it's clearly the biggest threat to the Caribbean. And I was leaning towards, yeah, let's focus on natural disasters and climate change, even though in the back of my mind, I said, well, but I'm part of this DMDU society, and we keep saying we need to look at wider ranges of threats. Maybe I should listen to that woman. And in the end, we said, well, let's focus on natural disasters. And then COVID happened, and now the Caribbean is in a awful economic situation because their economy is based on tourism and no one's flying to the Caribbean anymore. And the economic impact of that is much worse than a hurricane. And actually, it's interesting because the country director, she was using the example of Brexit. She kept saying, what if because of Brexit, the people in the UK stopped flying to the Caribbean? And everyone was like, it's not going to happen. And instead, we got a shock that's much bigger than that. So it's a good reminder that even ourselves, sometimes we're a bit lazy in what we're willing to consider.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that came up in the conversation yesterday when I recalled that Dan Kahneman, one of the foundational figures in behavior and risk, had in a New Yorker podcast, he had said he completely misunderstood the scope of the pandemic back in March. I think he was getting ready to fly to Paris. The only reason he didn't go had nothing to do with risk management. It was he made some mistake with his ticket or something. So he said he completely missed the true meaning of exponential. And this is Dan Kahneman, who got a Nobel Prize for his economic work around these issues. So yeah, we all seem to have a lot of work. And let me move to something that came up yesterday also in the webcast, which was the role of AI or machine learning, knowing these weaknesses that Gabrielle described in the way humans behave. Maybe I shouldn't even describe them as weaknesses, they're just properties. Knowing all the trade-offs we face, knowing how politicians will always favor the downplaying uncertainty rather than diving into it. Is there an app for that? Like, is there some way to use technology to help identify by just sort of having our glasses start to turn yellow, like a caution, like a warning light? This is one of those kinds of problems. Is that something we can expect? Maybe Nithi, I don't know how that feels, or whether I know you're using technology, talking about technology a lot, but can it help us?
It's, I always come back to this point. We sometimes go, God, what should we do to mitigate climate change? And, gosh, if only economists could come up with a way to, I don't know, put a price on, I don't know, I've heard some, you know what I mean? Like, we have the answers, right? It's not, some of this is not rocket science, and yet we can't get it done. And I think that point is lost because we've given up on some of the best solutions because they're so politically unpalatable. And I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think AI and machine learning can help because they simply encode the way we already work. Or we have seen. Hopes have been they will help us overcome our cognitive biases. They will help us, reach some kind of escape velocity for our cognitive failures. And they don't. They really reflect those failures that we already have. And we see this in criminal justice and all kinds of world. So unless we're solving a very bounded problem, like how do you get a car to drive down a snowy street, I am not so optimistic about the role of AI and machine learning to help us be better humans. I think what they can do is shine a light on where we are failing, but then it really is in a way up to us to embrace that and say, this is a failure, but I think ultimately they can't replace, in a way, our humanity.
That sounds like a very powerful cautionary tale for the idea of a Google Glasses Plus.
Well, I was also,
the...
just to jump in here, also humans are the ones that are making the rules as well. So when we talk about our cognitive biases or heuristics or kind of ethical judgments, that's embedded. So I think that's something to not forget as well.
So Gabrielle, just in terms of this idea of the frontier, then it feels, because this is a wicked, I think it's pretty clear to me that to get DMDU more widely applied and understood and normalized feels like a grand challenge, given path dependency from everything from how we learn to how our political structures are built. Where do you start? If again, we're going to start to get toward the last 20 minutes or so here. And I'd love it if someone could help summarize some of the questions that are coming in. It'll be hard for me to look at the comments and be...
They're coming in too fast and quick for me to keep up.
They're great. So if any of you see one that really catches your eye when you're not speaking and you want to kind of bring it up into the conversation, that'd be great. But anyway, so, what do you see as the starting point to a more rational, irrational? What does success look like in 10 years? Maybe that's a way to distill this.
Oh my goodness. I mean,
when I say success in 10 years, I don't mean we'll have a perfect decision-making process for complex threats in 10 years, but I mean, what would it look like to know we're on the right track? And maybe you are on the right track. Maybe this is it. Maybe DMDU's meetings just need to be on broadcast TV and more widely disseminated by people like me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, actually, I think this goes back to your question about, is more funding needed? And I would say that yes. And if we were able to actually invest in understanding how some of these complex processes play out, I think that would be extremely helpful. So for example, take, for example, sea level rise and relocation and migration, climate migration. If we were able to have a decades-long longitudinal study understanding the interactions and feedbacks between human systems and natural systems, we could learn so much from that. If we could make those types of investments, I think that would be incredibly helpful. So I think that would be in 10 years time. I think if we were making those investments, that would be a marker of success for me. I don't know what the other panelists think
No,
about
I'd love
that.
to hear from everyone on that one. So how do you know? I think you're on the right track. I think DMDU, the society is on the right track. I think it still feels to me kind of like, I'll give you an example. In journalism, there's a nascent organization called Solutions Journalism Network that's very slowly trying to torque newsrooms toward focusing on telling the story of problem solving in a news environment that's always about right now and about conflict and about the problem, but not about the, so DMDU to some extent feels to me like it's at the similar stage of the Solutions Journalism Network. It's great, it's there, but it still faces those impediments. So what tells us we're on the right track? What can we do?
For me, I want to, I'm not optimistic about our ability to solve certain kinds of problems without great shocks to the system. And so in a way, what I want to see this community do is be strong enough, large enough, and right at those pressure points so that when there's an opportunity, we have the answers. We've been working on this for a long time. We'll keep working on it. But especially for things like climate change, many would argue we've run out of time, but it can always get worse. So we're never quite run out. And so when I see, for example, China announcing massive billions of dollars of investment in carbon mitigation, emissions mitigations, that's an opportunity to align sort of the social and political motivations of the United States, for instance, to come back online. So in a way, I think while we continue to do the incredibly important everyday work of improving methodologies, improving outreach, finding solutions, there's a part of it, I think, for this community to be embedded. I almost think of us like embedded journalists, right? We can show up afterwards and report on the war that's happened, but for us to be embedded in every portion of government, waiting to find that right moment to pipe up and say, actually, I know how to do this. We know how to do this. And that's what I'm looking for.
That's exciting. I should, I'm taking notes here. If anyone here is typing, I'm sorry. And again, around the room, Julie, from your standpoint too, just.
I would say we'll know when we're on the right track when we see countries and governments putting in place some processes for making decisions based on consultations with a lot of people, based on consultations with experts, and with a process in place to monitor and revise, which I don't think exists in a lot of places for a lot of decisions. And that's what also DMDU and climate change and all these issues call for. It's not one person one day who's going to make that decision and then solve the problem for everyone forever. And COVID is showing that too. It's not like, I don't know, I'm French, and I've been following a little bit the response of the French president. He's decided that he was going to solve everything himself. He hasn't consulted widely. He hasn't even used the parliament for discussions about what they're going to do. He's just made a lot of executive decisions, and no one understands why he's made them. It's not really how democracy works. And I think there are new ways now, new technologies to actually improve democracy in the way we're making these big decisions. And that's kind of DMDU as well, right? And they did it for climate change, actually. After the yellow vests protested the carbon tax, they created this commission of citizens who for 6 months met every weekend to discuss what could be done to solve climate change. And they discussed with experts, and they came with a list of interventions that the president promised he was going to put in place. We're still waiting to see actually what's going to be implemented, but that list of solutions made a lot of sense, and it was very ambitious. And the fact that it came from a commission, from a group of citizens, was also very powerful. So if we could replicate that model regularly, including for COVID, I think it would show we're on the right track.
I'm a big fan of that. There's several other iterations of that model in the United States. There's a little organization called the Jefferson Center that started in the early 70s. They have a community scale deliberative process that they've used for even in conservative parts of the Midwest to generate consensus around climate and energy questions at the community scale. And it just feels like, but again, it has this property of being not a one-time meeting. It's an iterative, sustained engagement, community conversation. And one thing I like about the Paris Agreement, you know, everyone is unhappy with aspects of it, but to me, it was the first time in all this time covering climate change that the treaty process made its way toward just this architecture you've all been describing, which is iterative, comparing performance, reassessing periodically, ideally iterating, you know, innovating a little bit along the way. And I don't know, maybe we are inching in the right direction here overall. There are some great points here in the, let me see if I can highlight a few. Doug Samuelson's been very involved with some really good comments. He talks about the work of Ignacy Kalisiewicz, I can't say that last name, work on multi-criteria decision-making, as well as addressing the problem of how to make progress without forcing a multifaceted situation into a one-faceted model. That, I guess that gets to that point of plasticity. What one of you was talking about the Caribbean. Was that Julie? The Caribbean, you know.
Yes.
Well, I've heard this over and over again. Make sure you're prepared. Oh, no, it came up in the idea of disease X. When I was focused on Zika a few years ago. And that was around the time that I think the World Health Organization's, one of their advisory panels said, you always have to be thinking about disease X, the next thing. Don't be stuck on the threat you know. And that, I guess that gets one other part of the landscape that might be helpful to talk about before we close, which is setting aside a computer fix like an app. There still feels like there's huge potentials to navigate, use the data flows that are around us. You know, it's a very observed planet now to give decision-making more inputs to judge responsiveness and resilience. Is that adequately integrated yet into to create the landscape that DMDU can thrive in? You know, I'll give an example of, there's a professor at BU, I'm forgetting her name, who was monitoring parking lot activity in Chinese hospitals, you know, using satellite data. And you can get a very, very clear sense of which hospitals are having more problems. That's true everywhere, of course. And I think the corporate sector is doing the same thing in Walmart parking lots to judge, you know, economic activity. Is that a terrain that is meaningful here?
I mean, if I can, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask if Gabrielle had a thought, and then you.
Well, I can actually say in our own work, we are using a lot of satellite imagery to find out how people are responding to disasters, both big and small. So episodes, kind of more or less markers of slow change. So episodic flooding and things like that. And that's helping us understand how people are behaving. But then we also need to do some on the ground work to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing, in order to help develop policies and programs at the local level. So I do see it as being a part of the picture.
And Anita, you were going to say something about that too.
Yeah, building on that, I think, you know, there's another, I guess, a frontier is to make use of the tremendous amount of data that is hard to get access to, but is now more available than ever, right? In microscopic form, right? Where we're talking about what individuals are doing and also what's happening in an entire ecosystem. And so in a way, a lot of the uncertainty that we have can be informed by the kinds of data that we've never had access to. I mean, considering deforestation in the Amazon, patterns of burning land, what does that look like? How does smoke travel? these are opportunities for coming up with new kinds of policies, evaluating choices differently. They won't shrink the sort of existential human uncertainty that we always have about how will humans behave, but to understand reality a little bit better, more insightfully. I think that's tremendous. So it's the difference between saying I have an app to solve this problem versus I have information, I have data, I have knowledge that makes this entire problem look different and more perhaps solvable, more interesting, more, less, perhaps a little less tangled or differently tangled than it was before. I think that's an incredible frontier.
Anyone else on that point of technology? Just so we'll close out the technology question.
Well, actually, if I can, it's not exactly the same problem, but it's another one that's related to technology. It's, I think, one big uncertainty on my side, or a policy uncertainty, is are we going to be able to protect consumers and people from data stealing, for example, privacy data stealing, before all this data becomes unmanageable. I have a feeling that policy is much slower than progress on technology, especially on the digitalization side, in developing countries in particular. And I wonder how dangerous that can be for populations. I have no idea, because it's not really my area of expertise. I just feel like this is something that's scary to me, and it's one of the uncertainties I would love the society to focus on.
I have maybe one last question before your final, go-to statements. Is there an area where you feel this methodology is desperately needed, where it's not even begun to penetrate? CRISPR, I'm trying to think of, there's a big debate emerging about CRISPR that's mainly focused on the ethics questions of malaria mosquito control, where the African Union says, yes, let's go ahead with this technology if it's going to eliminate a mosquito that's already responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of Africans a year. And Europe is very precautionary, look at the same data and saying, we don't know yet, we have to go slow on a technology like this. That's just an example that comes to mind for me that seems desperately in need of new ways to break ground on how you move forward. But I don't know what's on, what would come to mind for you. We could stay with Julie if you have a thought on that. Where is this needed desperately, but not?
Well, someone said cybersecurity. I don't know. I imagine, or maybe I hope that the people working on cybersecurity are close to people working on defense, and that they're familiar with these approaches, and that they tend to actually be even more advanced maybe than what we do on climate, on dealing with uncertainty, but I have no idea. But I do hope that they have good methods and ways of approaching the problem, because I think it's a scary problem, probably scarier than climate change for me.
And,
but I don't know anything about it.
No. And maybe each of you. So Nithya, where is this needed, but not in the mix?
Well, I'm going to take a page out of Julie's book and talk about the things I don't know, and that frighten me because I don't know them, which is, I think our communities understandably spends a lot of time on topics where there are models. A lot of our work is on, I have a model for water resources, I have a model for energy. I never really, even now, still struggle to grasp what a new world of illiberalism, of nationalism, of a resurgence in, a certain kind of religiosity. I can hardly wrap my head around that. And I don't know that these are deep uncertainties. I hate to do the Rumsfeld unknown unknowns, but that's, for me, this reshaping of human society, in which all of this other work that we do operates, is where I think this kind of thinking is needed. And so I will broadly say, I think political science, social science, not to understand why do only to why do humans decide to do X, Y, and Z about climate change, but how are people changing? How are societies changing such that it's transforming the landscape of all the work that we do?
And that would include the social media communication landscape too.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Gabrielle?
Oh my goodness. I think I would echo that, just kind of the deep divisions that we're seeing that are just made evident, and I suppose shouldn't have been surprising, but just seems so much more self-evident after the election. I mean, I think that is a huge challenge. How to do all of this given the political situation that we're in right now. And then the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how do we consider these approaches when we're looking at compounding threats? We tend to study these things in isolation, but people are, with the pandemic happening and then all of these crises happening at the same time, how do we deal with it, the complexity?
Yeah, we've had some sessions on that issue of compound risk, although they're mainly in the context of emergency management and the like. At Columbia, some of my colleague who works with journalists and others, and that multidimensional landscape really does feel, to me, it drives me back toward the value in distributed capacities. What can we do that can convey at least some of this practice to the scale where a community facing some unexpected challenge can have the conversation that examines data, acknowledges cultural differences, and still drives toward some path that's a path of least regret. The distributed capacity, the scale question is really big. There are these things like nuclear terror, nuclear war are going to be, those are really top-down, discrete problems. But the one thing that's scary about the social issue is it's completely distributed. It's everywhere. It's 7.8 billion people or whatever. So maybe that is where we're going to leave off. I think there was a very popular book I mentioned in the 1971. I think it was released, called The Dice Man. A novelist with a background in psychology wrote a novel that was incredibly popular. Several million people bought it. And the solution there was to throw the dice when you came up to a situation where you didn't know what to do. And it led to it was like a horror story, really bad things were happening. So at the very least, I think we could be better than throwing dice, and throwing darts too, which is too often part of the issue going forward. So maybe, again, one last round. If is one thing you want to say to your own community as we close out here, we have a few more minutes. What's on the to-do list? Or what can I work on, as a communicator with contacts at the teachers' college, and like, what can we do next week that would be tweak things a little bit toward better outcomes? So is there anything like that you can think of? That'd be great. It's been great to be able to run this discussion. It's we have a couple more minutes, but you all have the final word. Maybe we'll start with Julie and then Nithi, and then back to Gabrielle one more time if you want.
Actually, you got me thinking about what I'm afraid of now and where they should.
Oh no.
No, I was thinking of a conversation I had the other day with friends that are very worried for the future of their children because of climate change. And I was telling them, I think your children will be fine. I'm worried about the poor people in sub-Saharan Africa, or even in some countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then I started thinking and was like, but then things could go wrong if, because of migrations, then there are some political conflicts that appear, and maybe eventually could be really bad for your children. But I don't know exactly what are the mechanisms through conflict and through big political changes that could lead to those catastrophic scenarios. And maybe that goes back to what Nidia and Gabrielle were saying on the political responses to sometimes small events, because I've seen what happened in France after terrorist attacks, and how strongly people react, and how strongly people are even willing to give up on some rights to be protected. And I think that's potentially scary. But in terms of things that are more optimistic, I think because of the pandemic, I hear everyone talking about resilience. It's become a very popular word. Speaking about psychology and policy, everything has to be resilient. And I think this resilience is a good entry point also to talk about uncertainty, but about the fact that it's about being prepared for anything and being able to bounce back in the face of unexpected events. And so maybe that resilience angle is the right entry point now for talking about DMDU approaches.
Well, maybe that's what we should call it. We all know the dark side, and there are some bright glimmers there. The comments here have been really, really good. I just wanted to post something. Someone had said, propagate tools for fact checking. That was Douglas again. And what I'm going to conclude by saying there is all the tools are there. We know how to find out what's real, but getting back to Gabrielle's really important point, you have to be motivated to know what's real. The motivated reasoning too often leads us to the tribalism or the thing that feels right, but making reality cool, have pull itself is really one of the grand challenges going forward. And thank you all for letting me be part of this conversation. I'd love to have you all back on my Sustain Wet webcast sometime. And I hope everyone got some value out of this. It looks from the comments like it was very stimulating, and I think you're doing some of the most important work on the planet. So let's keep at it. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. This officially concludes the annual meeting. It was a pleasure to have you. We want to thank you for all the energy and enthusiasm. This was a great annual meeting. You are a great community of full of hardworking, brilliant individuals. For us at the School of Government of Tecnological Monterrey, it was a pleasure hosting this meeting. And as we say in Mexico, mi casa es tu casa. See you soon, guys. Take care, have fun. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.